Hello, welcome to this video lecture on new technology programming. This learning unit is learning unit 3 and we'll be focusing on programming with Jade basic features. My name is Sinsaku Paloi and I'll be taking you through this lecture. What we hope to have achieved by the end of this lecture is a basic understanding of the Jade library, the execution path of Jade agents, programming software agents with Jade, executing defined tasks, agent communication, as well as the publishing and discovery services within Jade. The Jade programming software is basically Java-based. It uses the Java compiler. Jade itself is basically an execution environment, and there are basic libraries that one requires to run Jade on Java. For programming purposes, one can rely on any IDE really that can be used to develop Java. Typical ones are like your NetBeans and Eclipse, but as you know in class, we normally use NetBeans, and therefore I'd recommend the use of NetBeans as is the software that is also available in class. When you look a bit into Jade packages, you by now should have been aware of Jade.core, which is perhaps the most important library or package rather for one doing development on Jade, because you require that to implement any Jade code. There's also Jade.content, which is important for being able to create and manipulate complex content expressions. We also have got Jade.domain, which is essential for the implementation of the agent management service as well as the directory facilitator. Got Jade.GUI, which obviously is relevant for your GUI components with Jade. And then we've got the Jade.imt, which is basically your internal message transport protocol, and it's used for implementing that. You also have got Jade.lang.acl. You know by now that ACL is the communications language that we use within Jade. There are several others, but this is the one that were discussed in class. We also have got Jade.mtp, which basically enables Java to interface and implement MTP. When you think of an agent's execution path, and particularly when you look at the behavior attributes of Jade, this picture basically gives you that feel of how a Jade program will be implemented, particularly using behaviors. So for starters, you'll get into a behavior using setup, which is used for initializations in addition to initial behavior. You then have to check if an agent has been killed or if a do-delete method has been called. Okay, if it has been called, then it will invoke the takedown method, that is just to ensure garbage collection and proper termination of agents. If not, you can then be able to get the next behavior from the pool of active behaviors, and the action method is where whatever it is that you want done by that behavior will actually take place. So that within the action method, you'll then write whatever code you want the behavior to execute. Once you are done with action, you have to call the done method before you can exit. Okay, so at a high level, that is how a behavior within Jade is handled. And remember, your behaviors are where your core code is basically run from. You should by now also be familiar with the Hello World example. And for that, you'll have relied on the J.core.agent class, and you'll have had to redefine the setup method. Basically, when you look at the code snippet that is on your screen, you had to import J.core.agent to then be able to rely on extending agent for your class that you are creating, which in this particular case is test agent. You then created a function in order to print hello, and then you print the name of the agent, and then you say that particular agent is created. So you'd notice that this is your typical way of programming in Java. But of course, it's worth noting here that you had to extend agent for this code to can be related to Jade, and therefore you would have relied on the J.code that agent class or library to be able to use the extends method for agent. Okay, so I will speak quickly on this slide. Um, when you think about the various libraries that are available to programmers when dealing with Jade, you have the agent class, which you have just looked at now. It's got your methods like your setup, your get AID, which is the one that you have really relied on to be able to bring up the agent name, your do, delete, and take down. You have seen in that flow diagram, basically, some of these methods, just about all of them, actually. And then you've got the behavior class, which we basically, for that, require the action and done methods to be able to execute whatever task you want to execute in a behavior. And then you've got the ASL message class, which is basically for communication. It basically manages asynchronous message passing within Jade. And then you've got the directly facilitator service class, which is used to publish and search for services through method calls. So if you want to think of the DF service, just by way of reminder, this is kind of your yellow pages of agents. So the DF service will basically give you details on agents in terms of what the agents are called, what they do, etc. Almost like you would have with a yellow pages, traditional yellow pages service. Okay. Perhaps the most important example that accompanied the book and the installation that you had when you downloaded Jade is the book trading example, because the prescribed book rather takes one through that particular example, and it touches on most of the important concepts one requires to learn Jade. And in the book trading example, you will have noticed the following folder, the SRC folder, which in itself it is got under book trading, the buyer and the seller. You also have seen the classes folder, the library folder, which has got all those J.jar, J.tools, etc., some of which you basically require when you set up Jade to be able to run on your IDE. So that is basically just, in simple terms, the folder structure of the book trading, which I would like to advise you to go and have a look at. Okay. So we've got basically three main agent behaviors. Okay. But for starters, agents actually carry out jobs using behaviors, or they carry out tasks using behaviors. And the library from which you, or package from which you'll get behaviors is j.co.behaviors.behavior. And you'd often need to rely on the method at behavior. But like you have seen by now that on the example that I just dealt with a few slides back, you required setup at the beginning, and then you require the method action to effectively stipulate what it is that you want to happen in that particular behavior. And then you then had to call done when you are done implementing that particular action. And there are, like I said, several methods which will focus on the main three types, which are one-shot behavior, which completes in one execution. The cyclic behavior, just like the name says, executes for a specified action each time that is called. You've got the generic behavior, which basically executes different operations depending on the status of a particular value. And I'd like you to read a bit more when you get a chance about these behaviors, because they're quite important. I'll just give you an example now on code that would demonstrate the use of a behavior. So if you look at this particular code, you'll notice that the setup method is there, and this is just for instantiating the behavior. And then you then have inside the main class where you want to run your behavior, you have extended simple behavior because you want to rely on the simple behavior. We'll get to discuss some of these concepts later. But the issues that I wanted to bring your attention to at this point in time are basically the fact that you have your setup as I have alluded to earlier, and then you've got action. This is where your programming will go. So all the tasks that you want completed, or whatever action you want to take place, you program it under this action part. And once you are done, you come to the done method, which is basically, as you can see, it does everyone just one thing, which returns finished, to show that it's the end of that particular agent behavior. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is basically agent communication. So when agent 1 wants to communicate with agent 2, agent 1 will, for starters, prepare a message meant for agent 2, and then send that message through the distributed Jade runtime. When it gets to agent 2, that message will first be queued. So it will be posted onto a to message queue, and then with time, A2 will then be able to get the message from the message queue and process it. So that is at a high level how agent communication will happen between different agents. Okay, so when you think about aiding and rather sending and receiving messages using ACL, I just want to give you an example of an inform, which is almost like a notify basically within Jade. So here you've got your ACL message and the type of message you're using inform in this particular case. And then the receiver will be Peter. The language to be used will be English, and your ontology for this particular method will be weather forecast ontology. Remember, ontologies are particularly specific, whereas the language is more generic. And because it's a weather forecast, you notice that even the content that you set relates to weather in that it is domain specific, which is why it says today it's raining. Okay, and then at the end of all that preparation, you can then be able to send message. Okay, which is why you were when you instantiated message there, the inform message, you had to say message dot add receiver dot set language dot set ontology dot set content to then be able to send the message at the end through that object. All right, at the end of that, you can then be able to also receive a message. Once you have received that message, you can then process it accordingly. All right. I spoke to you about the directory facilitator, which is basically used for the publication and discovery of software agents. So if you look at this particular diagram, agent 1 has basically two services, service X and Y. Agent 2 has service Z. Agent 3 has service W, K, and H. In this particular case, agent A6 wants to exploit services within that basically belong to agent 3, which is why you see this relationship between them. Whereas agent 5 wants to check for services that are offered by agent 2, and the same for agent 4 wanting to use services offered by agent 1. In other words, given the 3 agents and their messages and their services that are published, other agents can be able, because these are published, the rest can be able to check and discover what existing agents already provide, so that they don't have to go and reinvent the wheel, but rather utilize what is existing as services from other agents. And that is basically the purpose of this particular slide. Okay, but to be able to publish in the first place, you need to do a couple of things. As you would see that in there, it's your initial instantiation, and then you need to get your set name to get the ID. And then from there, you need to set the service description. And in this particular case, because we're using the book selling, the book trading example, the type is book selling. And then you just append to the local name book trading, basically under your set name. And then you add the services that you have just defined right there. And then, of course, you'll then register that particular service under this try block, which is basically what has been mostly shown there on that block. Is just a reiteration of the important part of the code, because at the end you need to register that particular service. Okay, so basically that is it. That is required for one to publish. You'll have noticed that it catches an exception in case something goes wrong there. All right. So when you want to look at agent discovery, on the other hand, you have to first make sure that the template description is provided to the directory facilitator. You have to also list all the descriptions that match the provided template. Okay, and I will look at this particular example of the book buyer. You notice that the previous slide was actually looking at the book selling. Now we're looking at the book buying. It's still part of the book trading example. Without looking at some of this stuff, we start off with the setup there. And then in the setup, you'll notice that here we're now using the ticker behavior. And it basically works on a particular tick. And you then want to set up your description, your agent description, DFS agent description. You set up you instantiate your service, and then here you've got the selling type. Boom, you set the type to book selling, and then you add those particular services to the template. Okay, and then you then have under the try block. Basically, this is where you then be able to search for a particular template for a particular agent, a particular template rather for a particular agent. So basically, at a high level, that's what you would require to do. And after the discovery of a particular agent, you need to then clear that particular agent so that you are able to perform the same operation in future if you want to do so. Okay, so that's what we have. Some of these concepts that I've just spoken of are now used in a ping pong example. You'll notice at the very top that you are importing packages that you are quite familiar. We're importing packages that you're quite familiar with by now. Your Jade.core, Jade.core, behaviors for the behavior side of things, your ACL for the message, for the communication, your Jade.domain basically for the service description as well as the DF agent description. So the rest are basically just on the domain side. And then here, the example we're using is ping pong. You notice that the class is ping pong extending agent. And the agent, the behavior type we're looking at is simple behavior in this particular case. And that is the part I want you to focus mostly on. The next part, you'll remember I've spoken about the action method, which is where we'll go in all that you want to happen within that particular behavior. And this is just an example of that basically. So if the message that you get using performative is equals to, for instance, the info message that came through, you'd want to print a particular message. And this is just an example, like I said. And this is the message that you want to print. You want to get the local name, and then you print a bit of text, and then you put up the content that you want. You print out the message content effectively. And then after that, you can then reply using the content that you have then created. And this is basically the content that you will then set here before replying. Okay, so that is just instantiating the replying instance so that you can be able to reply. So in this particular case, if the message that the content that you got equals ping, you want to reply with pong. Okay, else you want to set the content to ping because it's a ping pong game. Okay, and then you send your reply. Most likely this reply will be sending pong, but it could be that if there was nothing set in the initial message, you'll just start the ping and then you'll receive the pong back. Once you are done with that, all that will happen here is that you do your done and then you return 0, rather 10 in this particular case. I mean, you could have returned anything, but the point is, after having called the action, the action method, you need to complete with the done. All right, and that is basically it. And this is just a further continuation of the example. When you now want to look at, for instance, how one will go about registering a particular agent and its services. And these are some of the things that we've already dealt with. If you remember, we've already looked at where you instantiate the DF agent description, and then you, as well as the service description, you've just set the name, and then here you set the get name as well for the service description, and then you set the type, and then you add the services basically, and you register here. So this is just in contrast to what I have showed you on basically registering a service earlier, and just to show you that this particular agent also at the end of the day will be registered for this ping pong example. Okay. All right, as we continue, you would remember that you had to also discover in the previous case, and you notice here that this is where you'll do the DF service search, the method that was shown in one of the previous slides, for you to can ultimately be able to discover the message. And at the end, you will so this would have basically started here, where you start with DF agent, and then your service description, and you set your type. In this particular case, you set it to tip, and then you've got your template, and then this is where you basically search the message, and the message that you want to send back is basically in the form of an inform, and then you notice that you are relying on that template that you have created. It's just almost similar to what we've discussed back there. And then here you'll then set the message to Pong, and then you send the message back. So it's as simple as that. But you can go and have a more detailed look at this example for it to make better sense to you. Okay, so at the end of, after you have called the setup, the action, and the done, you need to take down the service. Okay, it's almost like garbage cleaning within Java. So this is where you need to take down the service by deregistering the agent from the DF service. Okay, so once you have done that, the agent will no longer appear on the directory facilitator. Cool. I'll not even go into this slide, but it is more important for those that want to use the console to run Jade. But it's got some important information, but I will not even waste time on that, particularly because we hardly use the console in class. In fact, I prefer that students use the IDE to run the programs in class. By way of conclusion, we've seen that agents can be developed in any programming language, really. And for the purpose of Jade, we've seen that we mostly rely on Java. So we know that Jade basically is Java based. The Jade.core is one of the base classes basically that are required to be able to run the agents in the first place. And then the behavior is important as it determines the kind of operations that one would want to execute in a particular behavior. So whatever task you want to execute, you'll typically have that within the behavior class. Okay. We have also learned about the ACL, which is for communication. We have learned about the discovery and publishing using the directory facilitator. And we've also been able to see that agents can have a simple user interface effectively. So that's what we've managed to deal with in this particular lecture. And without wasting further time, I'd like you to please make sure that you check out the reference material, especially that from the book, the prescribed book, and the chapter here will mostly be chapter 4 and some parts of chapter 3. Best to spend some time on that book as it's got valuable information. And there's an exercise that I'd like you to now pause and attempt to solve. After having paused and attempted the problem, you'll find the solution in the next slide. Okay, so you'll find the solution in this slide as well as on the slide that follows that. This is just a proposed solution, really, and I would hate to see students replying exactly the same way. But the important thing to note with these solutions, the key concepts that one requires, for instance. Okay, for instance, for any method, you know that would require an action and a done, but for the wigger method, you'd want to you rely on the on wake, whereas for the ticker method, you'd also add the on tick method and so forth. So those are just some of the basic things that one would be looking at when we are marking your exam. And with that, we have reached the end of the video lecture, and I want to thank you for taking the time to go through this lecture. Thank you.